Welcome back to Just Talking. We have a great guest here today, and that is Heather Hendershot, who is the Cardiss Collins Professor of Communication Studies and Journalism at Northwestern. Heather, thank you so much for joining us today.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Okay, so at Northwestern, what courses do you teach at the School of Communication?
I'm pretty new there, so I'm still establishing what all my favorite courses are. I teach history and media technology class to grad students, and I've been doing an undergraduate class in media and American elections, which is just exactly my specialty. And I'm developing a new class this fall in journalism, free speech, and democracy.
Well, let's get a background on you. What courses and what schooling did you go to after high school?
I went to Yale University. And I got there thinking, "Oh, I'm going to be a high school French teacher because I really admired my high school French teacher. Um, or maybe I'll be a French translator at the UN. I just wanted to study French. But my passion was in film and film history at the same time. And I ended up being a double major in French and film studies, thinking, well, French is very practical, but film studies obviously is not. Uh, but then by the time I graduated, I wanted to keep studying film. So I went to the University of Rochester, which at that moment had a really strong program in film studies. Um, and it was a film program in an English department. And I ended up getting my PhD there, but studying television and writing my dissertation on children's television censorship. And the way I came to that was through one of the last courses I took in the history of American animation. I got really interested in Betty Boop, which, a very sexualized character who had been censored quite a bit when they took the theatrical cartoons and put them on television. So it was never really intended to be a children's cartoon, but when they put it on Saturday morning, they made it into a children's cartoon by cutting out bits and pieces and censoring entire cartoons. So I ended up writing a dissertation that was my first book on children's television censorship. And the rest is history. I could tell you more about what happened next, but I don't
Well,
want to get a word in edgewise.
in French studies, did you go to France at all, or why does it?
I did. I studied for a semester in France.
Oh, okay. And how
Um,
did you like it?
and well, what's not to like? I
Yeah,
was in France in college.
I've never been to France, so let's hear all about it.
Oh, well, let's see. I started drinking coffee in France. I was not a big coffee drinker till I went there, but it was just so chic. Luckily, I didn't take up smoking, but I took up coffee. And it was a great opportunity to watch tons of wonderful movies, really strong film culture in France, in Paris, especially in the 80s and into the 90s.
Hmm.
Now, of course, film culture is strong in general in France, but a lot of those movie theaters have shut down,
Hmm.
which is really sad. But you used to just be able to program whole days of just going to the movies all day, and they'd have an Ozu complete retrospective, his famous Japanese filmmaker, or a Truffaut retrospective, or Godard.
Who are you people?
It was a quite wonderful experience as a young film student.
And that's true. Now, we may go to the multiplexes on the weekends, but there's international films going on all the time around, especially being in the Chicago area. You got some great venues that show that those type of films that don't get the screenings that you normally get at a multiplex.
Exactly. I love living in Chicago for the film culture, and I go to the Siskel Film Center quite a bit. Siskel Center is wonderful in downtown, but also the Music Box Theater is one of my very favorite places.
And it says you also studied journalism as well. Did you ever tap in and be a journalist yourself?
No, I studied journalism history, and especially in the past, I've worked a lot on television journalism. And I spent a lot of time looking at Walter Cronkite's papers at the University of Texas at the Briscoe Center. And I wrote a book on television coverage, mostly on TV coverage of the Chicago Democratic Convention of 1968. And More recently, I've been working more in the history of print journalism. I'm doing a research project on Attica right now, the uprising in 1971. And I started that project looking at Tom Wicker's famous New York Times columnist, was actually inside Attica as an observer during that uprising. And so I was just got back from New York City looking at all of his papers there.
You brought up the 1968 Chicago Democratic Convention. Why was that historic in journalism times?
Wow. Well, uh, a lot of my research has been on right-wing media, historical and contemporary. I spent a lot of time thinking about Fox News, for example, and where we're at in terms of the contemporary media environment. Um, but back in 1968, the idea that we see promoted a lot today that mainstream journalism has a liberal bias, which I think is incorrect and really needs to be complicated. But that idea back in 68 was considered a regional idea. In other words, in the Deep South, they felt that way because they didn't like how they'd been covered during the civil rights years. And it was considered a kind of an extremist idea. People on the far right, like William F. Buckley Jr., who I've done a lot of research on, one of the co-founders of the conservative movement. So it was a kind of right-wing extremist idea. After the Chicago Convention, the idea that there was an inherent kind of liberal bias in the media, and a mistaken idea, I believe, became more mainstreamed and more nationalized. And a lot of that had to do with people's reactions to seeing the police brutality in Chicago during that convention. There were a lot of thousands of protesters there, and the police tear gassed them and beat them in the streets. And a lot of Americans reacted negatively, not to seeing police brutality so much as to saying that the networks must have covered it wrong. They didn't show the police point of view. They didn't show how the protesters had goaded the police and perhaps deserved to be beaten. And Nixon and his soon to be President Nixon and his Vice President Spiro T. Agnew really exploited this idea that the media were against them and that there was a liberal bias in CBS, NBC, and ABC at that time, which could not have been more possibly centrist and striving for neutrality, honestly, than they were in those years. It's a very different media landscape than what we see today.
And that's may leads to my next question, since you've studied so much on this subject. How do you feel the media is today compared to back then, like the changes in?
It's so hard to compare because it's so incredibly different. I mean, I find myself teaching undergraduates and trying to explain to them what a phone booth used to be and what it meant to not have a phone in your pocket and be able to take pictures whenever you wanted. And, a key part of journalism in the 60s and 70s is you show up someplace and you have a story and you have to phone it in. And if you can't find a payphone, how can you do your job, right? So just that level of technology is so many levels of technology are different. Um, and we've gone from a mass media environment where everyone sort of watches the same television shows and including news shows, and a formerly very robust newspaper environment, to an era in which many, many newspapers are declining, especially local newspapers are just going down, going under. It's really, it's very sad. It's hard for people to get local news. It's easy for people to get opinion and to follow influencers on TikTok who have a lot of opinions, which may or may not be correct, but it's not the same thing as news. So I think, and TV news is in some ways taking its last sort of gasps for air. One change that is really important that we don't often point to in thinking about news media history is going back to the rise of The Daily Show, 20 years ago, and how it brought entertainment to news, and in a new way that a lot of people thought might be negative, might be dumbing down the news. And ultimately, it was doing a lot of really smart coverage, but in the guise of humor. And it points to how news can be entertaining and still do a good job. Not that Jon Stewart and all of them were working journalists, right? So we don't want to say it's a substitute for the news. But that's a kind of tipping point of getting people interested in news through entertainment. And now that entertainment uh, perspective has, come to dominate a lot of television news for sure.
So your film studies, was there a certain film that you got interested growing up, or what was your background in the films, and what made you decide to research a lot of film studies?
Well, growing up, I grew up in Alabama in the 70s and 80s. And, just as I was going to college, VCRs began to exist, video cassette recorders, which were, replaced by DVDs, which were replaced by streaming. Although I would argue you still really need to own physical media if you want to have access to materials down the road. Um, so you were, at the time, I was kind of at the mercy of what local Birmingham, Alabama programmers sort of what movies they might put on late at night, just I used to watch a lot of Dean Martin, Jerry Lewis movies, but it was what was on late at night. And I enjoyed them. But there was still a kind of lingering art cinema movement from the 70s. 60s and 70s that sort of found its way, oddly enough, to Alabama. So there was a movie theater down the street that on I think it was Tuesday nights, which is like Mondays and Tuesdays are the slowest nights for movie theaters. They would have art films, and it was just kind of whatever they got their hands on. That I don't think they had programmers who understood the history of European art cinema. So you would just have kind of random choices of recent films from France and Italy and Spain, international fair. And then the University of Alabama in Birmingham had its own film series. And so you could see kind of somewhat artistic, somewhat independent kind of films there. And so that's why it was so exciting for me when I went to college and I could take classes in, intro to film studies and suddenly learn about, say, who Howard Hawks was, who John Ford was, who Lena Wertmuller was,
Who are you people?
who all the important directors were historically, to have access to them on 16 millimeter film.
I know we recently lost, you did study on Roger Corman. He and people that may not know him, he paved the way for a lot of film directors back then, and he was always independent and never sold out.
Absolutely. Yeah. I used to teach a course called Before Sundance, The Roots of American Independent Cinema, because the Sundance Film Festival was kind of a breakthrough for films like Sex, Lies, and Videotape, and Soderbergh, a lot of the new independents. But Roger Corman really paved the way in the 50s and 60s and 70s. He just kept going. He just never stopped making films, and he made sort of B-movie type horror films like The Wasp Woman, which is a treat. It's hard to find a good copy of it. But what he wanted to do was be wildly entertaining on an insanely small budget. So you see, movies about sea creatures, and they clearly are made from old mops with ping pong balls for eyes, and it's very cheesy. But he also realized the way to stand out in the so-called drive-in movie market was to have monster movies that also had a little bit of a liberal political message, because that made them stand out. That made them more interesting. So The Wasp Woman, great starter picture famously, he made Little Shop of Horrors. He made the first version of that with Jack Nicholson, right? But Wasp Woman, I would suggest people watch first. It's pretty interesting. This woman runs a cosmetic company, and she's getting a little bit older, like 34, ancient, right? So she can't be the beautiful face of her own cosmetics company anymore because the culture values only young women. And so naturally she gets a mad scientist to create some wasp jelly for her that makes her young, but spoiler, turns her into a wasp. But it's got it's not a deep feminist message, but it's there. He's trying to do something political. So he's a really interesting filmmaker. And he, as you noted, like he got so many people started. I mean, George Lucas started working for him, Steven Spielberg, Ron Howard.
All right. Hey, I don't need this. I don't need this working class hero crap.
James Cameron movies, James Cameron himself. A lot of really uh, later to be important filmmakers and actors got their start with Roger Corman, including Jack Nicholson.
Well,
Yeah.
that's what's kind of sad today, because when I look at multiplexes and they got a minimum of either 16 to 12 to 16 screens,
Yeah.
usually a quarter of them or half of them are playing the same movie. So it's like, any reason why that is, where they can't have one screen that shows either something independent or slash foreign film?
I know they're trying to crank as much money as possible out of these action movies, out of these franchises. And to me, it's very sad. There's a kind of tipping point in the 70s where Jaws is a huge hit. Now, Jaws is a smart and interesting movie that also is about a killer shark, right? But it's thoughtful and the acting is good. It's not just an action picture. And when Corman saw that, he was like, okay, if this is the future, the problem is I made shark movies and piranha movies and, werewolf movies, all this kind of stuff, because that was sort of where I could get a foot in the door. And it was kind of junk, but I made interesting films with, and if the mainstream now wants to see movies about killer sharks, what do I do, right? And eventually he made, he participated in like Sharknado and Sharktopus and all these kind of made for TV action movies, right? Which he enjoyed. I mean, he's still producing that stuff in his 80s and 90s. Um, but yeah, it's a whole sea change. And if you don't live in a big city, it's hard to go out to the movies to watch something interesting and different. Just something outside of a franchise. And I'm not even going to just say like an art movie, because it's not about art being good and popular movies being bad. But, how do you see an interesting relationship movie? That's not high art. It's just about two people talking about stuff or having, interacting. And in some ways, TV has taken over um, in ways that aren't necessarily negative in producing uh, high quality, interesting programming that isn't just about saving the world by, throwing buildings at people and beating up giant, I don't know, sharktopuses.
With all these, now there's a different ways of watching movies, where it's either on your phone or online or now at the movies.
Yeah.
Why should someone still go to the movie theaters and experience the movie theater experience?
Well, it might be very romantic and old-fashioned and, guilty as charged, but there is value to having collective experiences and not just collective because, oh, I got new followers with this, dance video I put up, but to be in the dark with strangers watching something together and finding it funny or sad or scary all at the same time, I think can be a really beautiful experience and fun too, right? It's not just it's fun. I've just got a book coming out on the Robert Altman movie Nashville, this terrific film released in 1975, and I watched it over and over and over again. I hadn't seen it with a crowd in, 20, 30 years. So I wrote the book, and then I went to the Siskel Center for the Cisco Film Center here in Chicago, and I introduced the film and I watched it to Sold Out House, which was fantastic. And then we had a discussion afterwards. And first of all, delightful to see the house filled for a 1975 brilliant Robert Altman movie that's 2 hours and 40 minutes long, right? Like there is room in the world for people with attention spans that can watch things longer than 20 seconds for sure. And the audience was a huge age range. There were people in their 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, which I love to see. The place was packed. And one of the funnest things was perceiving elements of this film that I've seen so many times that I knew objectively, like, yeah, people probably think the scene is funny. But to be with a crowd laughing hysterically at certain moments, it's a film that has a lot of serious moments, but also has a lot of funny moments. And I hadn't had that collective experience of enjoying the humor. There's this one character played by Geraldine Chaplin, one of Charlie Chaplin's children, and she's a satirical character. She's a deeply flawed person, played very broadly for satire. And when I watch the film by myself, I think, oh, she's so irritating. And I watch it with a group and they're laughing hysterically at her. And I hadn't enjoyed that experience really until I recently went to watch it at the movies. It was fantastic.
So what made you decide you're writing a publication on the film?
Yeah, I've got a short book coming out. It's published by Bloomsbury Press, but it's part of their British Film Institute series. And the BFI, British Film Institute, does um, single author texts on single movies and real classics, like Stagecoach or Rio Bravo or Only Angels Have Wings or M or Metropolis. And so it was kind of on my bucket list. I really wanted to write a book for them. And Nashville was a super match for me because so much of my own research is on the 60s and 70s, and much of it is on, journalism history and television, radio, broadcasting. But I also am very, very engaged with films from that era, which and in the 70s is a sort of golden age for American film history. So I've written on Dog Day Afternoon, which is a pretty brilliant Al Pacino movie from that era. I have a piece coming out about Jack Lemmon's movie Save the Tiger that he won an Academy Award for. Um, and Nashville is one of the sort of peak films of that era. So and it just expresses all of the concerns about America and anxiety. It's a very political film, but it's also a very personal film about interpersonal relationships.
If that's a movie where after you finish watching it, you definitely have to discuss it. I mean, you have no option to discuss.
Exactly, exactly. It's a real stunner, and people really did want to. It was so wonderful. We sit here for 2 hours and 40 minutes in the dark, enjoying this film together. And then I thought, well, a lot of people are just going to need to go. They're going to be so moved by the film, or it's a long movie, and they just stuck around for almost an hour to talk about it. It was
Wow,
fantastic. Yeah.
that's absolutely terrific. What's your feelings on the future of movies and the movie going experience?
Um, well, I'm very discouraged about the decline of movie going in theaters. And I really wish we could get people back out for that collective experience. And it's going to be harder and harder as the theaters close down. And it becomes uh, potentially a kind of boutique experience in a way, like people will watch movies together at museums, or in art galleries, or in places like the Siskel, and big cities will continue to have art cinemas. Um, and a lot of big cities have a thriving film culture still. You can go to Los Angeles and see Quentin Tarantino operates a couple of movie theaters there in particular that are fantastic. I went to a screening of the Music Box of Night Moves, a Gene Hackman movie from 1975. The house was very full at 11:30 in the morning on a Saturday. I went to see My Darling Clementine, which is a John Ford movie with Henry Fonda from maybe the late 30s. I'm blanking out, late 30s or early 40s, and the house was packed. So there are still cinephiles who want to go out to the movies, which is fantastic. But they're going to have a hard time if they live in suburbia, if they live in, a lot of parts of middle America. So I'm uh I'm guardedly optimistic, but I might be a little naive to feel optimistic.
Well, Heather, it's just been a pleasure talking with you. If people want to either learn or see more of your published works, is there like a website, or where should they go to learn
My
more?
website is sadly not up to date.
Okay,
But if you Google my name,
okay.
my last book on the Chicago Convention was published by University of Chicago Press. It's called When the News Broke, Chicago 1968 and the Polarizing of America. If you look up my name and Nashville, you'll see that book is available for pre-order already, and it's beautifully illustrated. They make the most gorgeous books. So that's the next one. And my Corman essay has just come out, but it's from a scholarly press. It's a little bit harder to find. And I also read a book on William F. Buckley Jr. and his TV show Firing Line. That was published by HarperCollins, and it's called Subject to Debate. So that's something people might look into if they're interested in when on TV, conservatives and liberals there was a possibility of an interesting conversation that wasn't just about shouting and insulting, that it was a kind of intellectual exchange. So it's nostalgia in a way, but it's a very interesting historical moment to revisit.
And then if they want to take any of your classes or courses, just go on the Northwestern website.
Go to Northwestern, yeah.
All right. Well, Heather Hendershot, I want to thank you so much for talking with us today. You're very knowledgeable on all media areas, and we thank you so much for telling us today.
It was a pleasure, Jason. Thanks so much for having me.